Something is still hiding on this planet, and it's not buried under the ocean or floating somewhere in deep space. It's alive right now in the frozen silence of the Arctic explorers. Recently encountered a tribe so isolated, so untouched by modern civilization that what they discovered left even veteran scientists shaken. Strange rituals, unexplained symbols, carved into ice stories passed down for generations that describe things no isolated tribe should possibly know. But this Arctic mystery is only the beginning. Across Earth, there are still tribes completely cut off from the modern world. Communities that reject outsiders, vanish into forests without a trace, and protect secrets that researchers say could rewrite parts of human history. Some have never seen electricity. Others believe the outside world is cursed, and a few are so dangerous that governments forbid anyone from going near them. Before we expose the chilling discoveries scientists uncovered, hit like and subscribe, because some believe these stories are being buried for a reason. From the deadly jungles of Brazil to frozen Arctic wastelands, these are the tribes that still give scientists goosebumps. And what they are hiding may be far more terrifying than anyone expected. 1. The Naga. This land is Naga land, a nation forgotten on the borders of India and Burma. Among the Naga people of the dense mountains bordering India and Myanmar, a man who grew old without killing another human being was treated as a permanent child for the rest of his life. He could not marry. He could not speak in community decisions. He had no rank, no tattoos, no voice, and no path forward. Regardless of how many years he had lived on this earth, the entire social structure of the Naga was built around one single and brutally simple requirement, and that requirement was the taking of a human head. This is neither a symbolic gesture nor a ritual reenactment. It is a real human head, severed from a real human body and carried home as physical proof of what a man had done. The Naga were more than 40 distinct warrior clans living in the dense mountains on the border of India and Myanmar, each with its own dialect and rituals, but all governed by the same merciless social law. A man's rank, his right to speak his entire identity as a human being, came from killing. The skulls of murdered enemies were brought home, placed in positions of honor, fed, regularly spoken to before major decisions, and treated as active members of the community whose counsel the living genuinely relied on. When British colonizers pushed into Naga territory in the 19th century, they discovered very quickly that they had made a serious miscalculation. The Naga used women and children as a living intelligence network, feeding real-time information on British troop movements to warriors while moving freely through British lines without suspicion. The Anglo-Naga Wars dragged on for decades and produced more British casualties per square mile than almost any other frontier campaign across Asia. Officers who had fought in Africa and the Middle East described the Naga as the most ferocious warriors they had encountered anywhere in the empire, but underneath the warrior glory was a machinery of coercion that destroyed young men who had no stomach for killing. A boy who reached adulthood without taking a head was not simply disadvantaged. He was publicly and permanently humiliated by a system specifically designed to make killing feel like the only rational choice. When communities suffered crop failures or disease outbreaks, raids were sometimes directed not at traditional enemies but at weaker neighboring Naga clans who had done nothing to deserve it. The system demanded heads to function. If a just war did not exist, an unjust one would be manufactured. When the British formally banned head hunting in the early 20th century, colonial authorities began receiving reports that disturbed them enough to make a deliberate decision to look away. The raids had not stopped. Heads were still being taken, but hidden rather than displayed. The British maintained the fiction that their ban had worked because reopening the confrontation was more expensive than pretending the problem was solved. The 20th century changed nothing essential. The Naga independence movement used torture, forced taxation of terrified civilian populations, and the public execution of Naga villagers accused of working with the Indian government. The culture that celebrated the taking of heads never stopped taking them, it just stopped calling it head hunting. 2. The Chukchi. Before Russian soldiers ever reached a Chukchi settlement in the 18th century, the families inside had already decided what they would do. When the soldiers arrived, the men would kill the women and children first. Then they would kill themselves, not as a last desperate act of panic, but as a calm, pre-agreed plan made weeks or months before any attack. Russian soldiers documented arriving at settlements to find dead bodies arranged quietly in a silence born of decisions made long before the soldiers got there. Those soldiers reported that nothing in their entire military experience had broken their will the way those scenes did. Not battle, not starvation, not the biting cold. Walking into a room full of people who had chosen death over Russian captivity destroyed something in them that combat never had. Chukotka sits at the extreme northeastern tip of Russia, where winter temperatures drop to -50 degrees, and the polar night swallows the sun for months at a stretch. The Chukchi had not only survived there for thousands of years, but had built a society so tough that when Russian Cossacks arrived in the 17th century to collect fur tribute, as they had done with brutal efficiency, across all of Siberia, the Chukchi simply refused, not briefly, not symbolically. They waged active guerrilla warfare against the Russian Empire for nearly 150 years without breaking. They poisoned trade goods deliberately and systematically. They supplied diseased animal hides to Cossack traders with such calculated regularity that Russian military commanders wrote formal dispatches identifying it as an organized biological warfare centuries before the concept had a name. They vanished into frozen terrain that killed pursuing soldiers within hours. Russian Empire formally surrendered. They abandoned conquest entirely, offered autonomy trade agreements, and accepted that these people would not be subjugated, making the Chukchi one of the only indigenous peoples in all of Siberia. The Russian Empire never fully conquered. Then the Soviet Union arrived and did something the Sacs never thought to try. Instead of fighting the Chukchi, it took their children away. Soviet programs forcibly removed Chukchi children from their families and placed them in state boarding schools where speaking their language was a punishable offense. What was stripped from those children was not just culture, it was survival knowledge. How to read the weather before a storm kills you, how to navigate sea ice without falling through, how to build a capable of keeping a family alive at -50 degrees. When those children came home, they could not pass on this essential knowledge because the chain of knowledge had been deliberately and permanently cut. Today, the suicide rate among Chukchi men between 15 and 35 is among the highest recorded for any demographic group in Russia. The descendants of the people who forced the Russian Empire to retreat are now facing a crisis of despair that scientists still struggle to fully explain. 3. The cargo cults of Melanesia. American soldiers who watched the cargo cults wrote in their diaries that the experience was more deeply disturbing than anything they had encountered in actual combat. What disturbed them was not the bamboo aircraft or the wooden headphones. What disturbed them was the slow and nauseating realization that everything they were watching looked exactly like what they themselves did every single day. For thousands of years, the people of Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea lived on their Pacific islands with no knowledge of the industrialized world. Their societies were built around ancestor veneration, ritual exchange, and a belief that performing the right ceremonies correctly produced results. That was not superstition. That was how reality worked. And thousands of years of experience gave them no reason to doubt it. Then the Second World War arrived and shattered every framework they had. American and Japanese military forces descended with ships, aircraft, and warehouses packed with manufactured goods unlike anything the islanders had imagined possible. There were canned food, medicine, radios, weapons, clothing, and machinery in quantities so enormous the islanders had no existing concept to contain them. None of these goods were made on the island. They arrived from somewhere else, always from the sky or the sea, always after specific rituals were performed. Military personnel marched in formations, raised flags, spoke into metal boxes, and within days, enormous aircraft descended loaded with more cargo. The pattern was clear. These were ceremonies for summoning goods from powerful beings in another world, and the ceremonies worked every single time. The islanders absorbed this, the only way any rational person absorbs new information, by fitting it into the framework they already had. White soldiers had discovered the correct rituals for communicating with beings who controlled material abundance. Those rituals, if copied precisely, would work for anyone. This is where the name comes from. Cargo is the word colonial administrators used for the manufactured goods the islanders believed they could summon. Cult is the word outsiders used for the religious movements that formed around the belief that the right ceremonies would deliver those goods. When the war ended and the bases were dismantled overnight, the islanders built bamboo copies of aircraft and placed them in jungle clearings. They cleared landing strips and lit fires along the edges at night to imitate runway lights. They then sat in wooden towers wearing headphones carved from wood, speaking into bamboo microphones, performing every ritual detail they had watched produce results. On the island of Tanna in Vanuatu, a movement centered on a figure called John Fum emerged and never disappeared. His name is almost certainly a distorted memory of the phrase John from America. His followers have held formal marches every February 15th for decades carrying bamboo rifles, drilling in formation and waiting for a return they believe is genuinely coming. When the promised cargo repeatedly failed to arrive, the movements did not collapse. They identified the reason the same way every time someone in the community was spiritually contaminated and blocking the delivery. That process almost always ended with violence directed at whoever was most vulnerable. American soldiers watching from the jungle understood none of the theology. What they understood was the shape of what they were seeing. Men in towers wearing headphones, flags raised at dawn, formations marched in silence, rituals performed with total seriousness because the rituals had always worked before. They were watching themselves. That was the part they could not shake. 4. The Camper of Tibet. The Central Intelligence Agency recruited Tibetan warriors, trained them in the mountains of Colorado, equipped them with weapons and radios, dropped them back onto the Tibetan plateau, and gave them explicit assurances that American support would continue for as long as they kept fighting. Then, in 1972, when President Nixon normalized relations with China, the CIA terminated the operation overnight without warning and without any acknowledgement that these men had ever existed. The fighters who survived mostly chose never to tell their communities what had happened because telling the truth would have destroyed the last surviving will to resist. They carried the betrayal alone until they died. The car came from the eastern Tibetan region of Khet territory that had never been fully controlled by either the Dalai Lama's government in Lhasa or the Chinese emperors in Beijing. Tall warriors with long hair braided with red threads and daggers permanently at their belts. They lived under a code of honor that recognized no outside authority. When China invaded Tibet in 1951, it was the Khmer who organized the first serious armed resistance. While the rest of the world was still deciding whether to pay attention, they formed Chushi Gangru, a guerrilla army that fought the People's Liberation Army at altitudes where the human body begins to break down from oxygen deprivation alone. The Chinese response was aimed precisely at what made the camper who they were. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were demolished. Monks were publicly executed or dragged to labor camps in numbers large enough to remove an entire class of community leadership. Chinese authorities understood that the combination of warrior ferocity and deep Buddhist devotion in Kha identity was a unified source of strength, not a contradiction to be exploited, and they went after both elements simultaneously. The traditional horse fairs, where camper warriors had demonstrated trick riding and horseback shooting as proof of military readiness, were banned for decades. When Chinese authorities eventually permitted them again, they had been redesigned as tourist performances for Chinese domestic visitors. The same skills ancestors used to prepare for war were now performed as entertainment for citizens of the country that had destroyed everything those skills were built to protect. The fighters who escaped to Nepal and India after the resistance collapsed needed money to survive. They found it through drug trafficking along Himalayan routes that their knowledge of the terrain made them uniquely positioned to exploit. The Tibetan government in exile quietly distanced itself from these men publicly, while continuing to use their existence as a political symbol in international forums. The men who had believed a promise made in Colorado were used twice, abandoned twice, and left to become criminals or disappear. 5. The Kuna of Panama. The revolution that secured the Kuna people their freedom began with the Kuna publicly executing other Kuna people. These were not foreign occupiers. They were community members who had cooperated with the Panamanian government and those who had accepted small positions under colonial administration. They were identified, tried by the community, and killed openly as a message about what absolute solidarity required and what the price of deviation would be. That is how the celebrated Kuna Revolution of 1925 actually began. And that part is almost never included when the story is told to outsiders. The world knows the Kuna primarily through their molar textiles, brilliantly colored geometric fabric panels, that appear in galleries and travel magazines across the world. They have built the Kuna an international reputation as a peaceful, artistically gifted people who deserve admiration. That reputation has also served as a very effective shield against scrutiny of what life inside Kuna society has actually demanded of the people born into it. The Kuna live on the sandblast islands off the Caribbean coast of Panama. Their understanding of the world is built on the belief that every illness, every accident, every drought and every social conflict results from a specific spiritual imbalance that must be corrected before more damage spreads. The people responsible for diagnosing and treating spiritual imbalances are called the Nyla. A Nyla is not a role anyone chooses. Children who show specific signs in early childhood, such as unusual dreams, unexplained seizures, and prolonged social withdrawal, are identified as candidates. They are then subjected to years of isolation, extreme fasting, and ceremonies involving powerful hallucinogenic plants. The Kuna openly acknowledge these ceremonies are psychologically dangerous and sometimes fatal. Children who die during the process are understood as taken by the spirit world. Their deaths are treated as sacred confirmation of the process's power, rather than evidence that it kills children who had no choice in being selected. In 1925, the Panamanian government banned traditional Kuna dress and rituals and sent police to enforce those bans on Kuna Islands. The Kuna launched a violent rebellion that forced Panama to recognize Kuna Yala as a semi-autonomous territory. Today, outsiders cannot purchase land on Kuna Islands. Tourism is tightly controlled. The border between Kuna territory and the outside world is maintained with an intensity that reflects a genuine and documented terror of contamination. But that same framework of cultural protection has been used in documented cases to justify the violent expulsion of mixed-race individuals born on Kuna territory. People whose ancestry did not meet the community standards were removed from the only home they had ever known, and the Kuna's powerful international reputation has largely prevented those cases from receiving the examination they deserve. At the center of Kuna social life sits the Nyla, whose authority cannot be questioned. When the Nyla identifies a person as the source of spiritual contamination, that identification is final. No appeal exists. Accusation and punishment flow from one mouth, and one mouth only protected by a faith so complete that questioning it is itself treated as evidence of guilt. In a system built that way, the most dangerous person in the community is never the outsider. It is the one person whose judgment can never be challenged. 6. The Surma and Mercy of the Omo Valley. In the Omo River Valley of Ethiopia, a 13-year-old girl sits down and lets someone push a sharp wooden peg through her lower lip, and that is just the beginning. Over the following months and years, progressively larger wooden discs replace the original peg, stretching the flesh further each time until her lower lip holds a clay plate up to 20 centimeters across. The pain is not incidental to the process. The pain is the point. The larger the plate she endures, the higher the price her family receives in cattle when she is sold into marriage. Her suffering has a precise market value, and everyone around her has always known exactly what that value is. The Surma and Mercy people have lived in the Omo River Valley on the border of Ethiopia and South Sudan for thousands of years in near complete isolation from the outside world. That isolation produced cultures of extraordinary intensity. Ritual scarification marks both men and women. Cuts are opened in the skin into which ash or plant juice is rubbed to raise permanent scars, with each pattern recording clan membership, enemies killed, and personal history. The body is used as a living document written entirely in controlled pain. The primary male initiation ritual is called the Donga. Dozens of warriors fight each other with long wooden poles in bouts that produce serious injuries and regular deaths. The winner earns the right to choose any unmarried girl from the village as his own. The girl has no formal mechanism to refuse. The fight deciding her future happens without her participation, and the outcome is presented to her as a completed fact. Decades of regional civil wars in Sudan and Ethiopia flooded the Omo Valley with Kalashnikov rifles, and the effect was catastrophic. Cattle raids that once produced a handful of deaths now regularly killed dozens in a single night. Entire villages have been documented wiped out between sunset and sunrise. Girls who try to refuse the lip plate face dramatically reduced marriage prospects, lower family status, and a lifetime of community marginalization that punishes everyone connected to them. Women who develop serious infections from lip plate procedures do not seek outside medical treatment because doing so is understood as a rejection of community values. Children die from vaccine-preventable diseases because refusing outside medicine is a point of cultural principle. The Ethiopian government has documented the resulting mortality rates and chosen to do nothing because intervention would trigger a political confrontation. It has consistently decided is not worth having. The Ethiopian government has also announced dam projects that will flood large portions of Surma and Mercy traditional territory. Communities are being relocated to resettlement camps where traditional cattle hearing is impossible. The government has used the tribes' documented violence and rejection of state authority as legal justification for stripping their land protections. The isolation that preserved them for thousands of years is now being cited as the legal reason they have no rights worth protecting. 7. The Asmat and the Batak. Two governments buried the truth about what happened to Michael Rockefeller for more than 50 years. And they buried it deliberately because the truth was too politically inconvenient to tell. When the 23-year-old son of American millionaire and future Vice President Nelson Rockefeller disappeared in the remote swamp forests of southwestern New Guinea in 1961, Dutch colonial authorities told the Rockefeller family within days that Michael had almost certainly been killed and eaten by Asmat warriors. Then those same authorities helped construct the official story that he had simply drowned. The United States government knew the truth. The family knew the truth. And for more than 50 years, the actual answer sat quietly in Dutch colonial files while the world was told there was no answer at all. The Asmat people had lived completely sealed off from the outside world until the mid-20th century, deep in a landscape of swamp and forest so impenetrable that it had kept them invisible to the rest of humanity for thousands of years. They built one of the most sophisticated wood-carving traditions anywhere in the world, alongside a cosmology in which every non-elderly death was understood as murder by enemy sorcery. In the Asmat universe, there were no accidents and no natural illnesses. Every death created a debt the community was spiritually obligated to repay with a killing of its own. When an enemy was killed, his body was consumed not out of hatred, but out of precise spiritual logic. Eating him absorbed his strength. His skull was kept as a sleeping pillow so his wisdom could pass into the living through dreams. His name was given to a newborn to fill the gap his death had created. Only after all of this could the soul of their own killed community member finally find peace. Journalist Carl Hoffman spent years investigating Michael Rockefeller's disappearance and interviewed Asmat elders with direct knowledge of the events. His conclusion was precise. Michael Rockefeller swam ashore after his boat capsized and reached a village whose warriors had recently watched their own men shot dead by Dutch colonial police during a crackdown on local violence. The Dutch had created a blood debt inside the Asmat spiritual accounting system. Michael Rockefeller arrived on the beach as the first available payment. The killing was not random. It was the fulfillment of an obligation the Dutch had triggered and then sailed away from. After the disappearance, missionaries entered the region in greater numbers and used Michael Rockefeller's death as a conversion tool, telling communities his spirit would haunt them permanently unless they accepted Christianity. They turned the Asmat's own spiritual beliefs into a weapon to destroy those same beliefs from the inside. And it worked within a single generation. The Batak people of Sumatra practiced something equally calculated. Convicted criminals, adulterers, traitors, and spies were tied to posts and eaten alive by chiefs and warriors as a formal legal act of community purification. But people accused of causing deaths through sorcery faced the identical process with no physical evidence required. The machinery of sacred justice and the machinery of mob accusation were the same machine. And once it started moving, there was no appeal and no way out. These are not ancient stories. They are happening right now today, on the same planet you woke up on this morning. Cultures built on pain, betrayal, survival, and defiance are being swallowed quietly by a world that calls itself civilized. And the most disturbing truth of everything you just heard is this: the cruelty did not come only from the outside. In almost every single case, the most devastating damage came from within.